Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today, in this second video, I'm going to talk about how I create accurate color sketches from photographs. If you'd like to watch the first video, I'll leave a link in the description below. Let's dive in. The first thing I do is tint the canvas. And I usually choose a color that's kind of a midway tone between all the colors. I don't spend too long on this, I just roughly paint it in. The reason I do this is because I find it much easier to get the colors correct than on a stark white background. For this study, I wanted to establish some of the gray tones first, and then I moved on to something approaching the strong highlight on the left side of the skull. As the skull is somewhat porous in nature, I decided to use a chalk brush to bring out some of that texture in these initial marks. Next, it was on to establishing some of the darker areas around the terminator line just above the left eye socket, as well as on the bridge of the nose, the teeth, and the chin. Once I had that down, it was a bit easier to get some of the mid-tone values right in comparison. As you can see, I'm not zooming in at all at this stage, as I want to see how the image is developing as a whole, and to make sure that the values and colors are matching. I'm also just loosely indicating where the colors are as placeholders, so that when I do a details pass, I'll know that everything is in the right place, without any additional guesswork. For the back of the skull, I decided to flip the study so as to make it a bit easier for me to get the shapes correct. I then turned off the sketch layer and roughly indicated where the main shadow would be, so I could get a sense of where it was in space. Now that all the main elements were in the right place, it was time to tackle the details. Here I spent time refining some of the shapes and getting the elements to be closer to the photo. I'm also paying close attention to the photo so as to get the subtle color differences correct, which will in turn suggest form variations in the skull. Again, I'm still fairly zoomed out so as to make sure that everything is balanced and that I don't over-render one area. At this stage, I'm still adding in different values and not really worrying about making them look pretty. Real quick, if you're enjoying the video, please consider liking and subscribing, as this will make it much easier for me to continue making this type of content. Now, back to the video. Once I got to the teeth, I decided to zoom in a bit, so as to get all the smaller shapes correct. Occasionally, I turned on the sketch layer to check that everything was still in the right place. After the teeth were basically done, I then flipped the sketch, zoomed back out a bit, and started bouncing around the skull if I noticed anything that didn't look quite right. I also started modeling some of the major forms so that the skull would have a more 3D look to it. When it comes to blending, I don't like to soften all of the brush strokes. I think that there's a fine line between the right amount of blending and too much. I prefer to have a more painterly look to my work, which has a variety of interesting edges, as opposed to something that looks too soft or airbrushy and without a solid form. Next, I zoomed out even more so I could check the values and some of the color transitions. I also wanted to see how all the shapes were looking, and I went back over some of those that needed to be developed a bit further. After that, I zoomed back in to model the teeth a bit more. Overall, I felt that some of the edges were looking a bit too sharp, and so I softened the edges where needed and added some additional rendering. Throughout this study, I divorced myself from trying to paint a skull and instead concentrated on just painting shapes. Not only does this help with putting everything together, but it also allows me to move away from relying too much on assumed information. And by that I mean painting what I think the skull should look like as opposed to what is actually in front of me. Once all the main details were in the right place, I moved on to the finer details. And I started with the most challenging area, the teeth. I also worked on modeling the areas around the teeth. To get these areas correct, I spent a fair amount of time really analyzing the photo. Next, I moved on to the light that was coming through the thinner bone on the side of the nasal cavity. This area was one of the most interesting aspects of the photo, and I wanted to make sure that I described it as accurately as possible. Then it was time to start adding some of the reflected lights and colors into the shadow areas. I find that subtlety is the key when adding these colors. If they're too dark, light, or saturated, they just won't look right. After all, they're simply there to enhance the overall image and not command too much attention. After that, I went ahead and refined some of the edges, and I added some reflections into the main shadow areas. Once that was finished, I played around with different edge effects for the background, just to see what it would look like, as well as darkening off some areas to highlight the skull as much as possible. I also added an indication of wood grain to the cabinet the skull was sitting on, and then some subtle cracks in the skull itself, as well as some brush strokes to the edges of the skull to suggest movement in a somewhat static composition. In the end, I zoomed out, discarded the edges on the background, and just painted it out, as I thought it looked better. In part 1, I highlighted the fact that I think that drawing is a fundamental skill for all artists, and that the better your drawing skills are, the better your paintings probably are, which I think I've managed to demonstrate with this sketch. Not only is this sketch accurate, but because I spent the time making sure that the underlying drawing was correct to begin with, the actual painting part went much faster and was a lot more enjoyable than if I just winged it and had to go back over things multiple times to correct them. Thanks for watching, and I hope this was helpful. And if it was, please consider liking this video and subscribe to my channel, as this will make it much easier for me to continue creating this type of content. Also, let me know if you have any questions or if there's some other aspect of painting that you'd like to see in future videos in the comments below. Have a good one, and keep on painting.